Finally completed Ocarina of Time just about 26 years after it initially came out on the Nintendo 64, and I wanted to make this video to go over my thoughts and my experience with the game. Growing up, I didn't have a Nintendo 64, I had a PlayStation, and while I played some amazing games on there, I never got the chance to play Ocarina of Time. Now before we start the video, I want to take a little nostalgia trip and go back to 1998 so you get an idea and we set the scene of what was going on back then and how long ago it actually was.
Think of all the mature, responsible things you could be doing. Helping old ladies cross the street, proudly maintaining your yard, hanging with your folks, or cleaning your room. But get real, you'd rather be playing video games.
If you buy only one video, make it the experience of a lifetime. On September 1st, you can take the voyage home, Titanic.
Hey, little buddy, want a ride?
Pikachu!
Yeah, whatever.
So back in 1998, we still weren't streaming, we were going to Blockbuster every weekend. Titanic was the biggest movie in the world. Pokemon had just come out, and we all learned who Monica Lewinsky was.
Miss Lewinsky.
Interesting times to say the least, but some of the golden years for gaming, and Ocarina of Time is one of the biggest reasons why. The version that I ended up playing was the Nintendo eShop version on my Switch, so I played it on there, and what we're going to go over in this video is the following. First, we're going to go over the gameplay, we're going to go over the graphics and sound, and overall just the world building of this game, the story, and then some comparisons to some of the most amazing games I've ever played, and see how Ocarina of Time has influenced the video game industry. But enough with the intro, let's travel through time and get lost in the water temple for hours as we go over what many consider one of the most influential and incredible video games of all time. Usually when I play older games, just for the sake of nostalgia or to try something I haven't tried before, a lot of the times what happens is the games just don't hold up very well. A lot of the mechanics are just older, clunky, not as immersive compared to the technology that we have nowadays, right? Well, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Ocarina of Time is perfect by any means, but it sure holds up really, really well. Which I think is wild to be able to say, seeing that even back then, we didn't have two analog sticks on the N64 controller. You had one. So you really couldn't move the camera around. You had to use the Z button to straighten it out. So it is a little bit awkward. It's a bit of an adjustment to go back to this. But really, it holds up really, really well. And the Z lock system is a big reason why. So the Z lock system, or what I think would be more accurately referred to as the Z targeting system in Ocarina of Time, was absolutely revolutionary. At this time, video games didn't really have anything like that. I know games had somewhat of a lock-on system. You know, I think of games like Armored Core, maybe even Tomb Raider. But to fine-tune it to this point where you can strafe around enemies, switch weapons, and keep your perspective in the correct place at all times is truly something that dictates how games are made to this day. And I think it's one of the staples, looking back in time, of a gameplay element that has carried on and changed how games are made.
Think back to some of the more popular video games in the last couple years, in the last decade, and how critical of a mechanic locking on is.
I think the best and primary example is Soulsborne, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, games that changed my life really and how I felt about gaming, and you know, sparking that fire again of why I love video games. And to look back and see how Ocarina of Time influenced these games is incredible. The influences are everywhere. And I do think that in terms of elements that change how we play games and how games are designed, it's up there with some of the most incredible, important games that have ever been made. Some examples for me, I would go with Half-Life 1, right? With immersive storytelling, not just cutscenes, not just text, but living through it, being in the situation and not having to cut aside from the gameplay where you're in that perspective the whole time. That's up there with that. Resident Evil 4, over the shoulder aiming. Resident Evil 4, one of my favorite games of all time, and has influenced some of the best shooters in games that we have seen since its release, and still holds up to this day as well. And my last example that I'll use for revolutionary game ideas is Metal Gear Solid, right? With the blockbuster ideas and tactical stealth elements. All this to say just how important Ocarina of Time was and is for someone like me who didn't even get to play it in my youth, still understands like, okay, we owe a lot to this game. But here's something I wanted to go over and specifically highlight is when people talk about the best games of all time, right? They look back at Half-Life, Super Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong Country, whatever it may be for you, right? And I feel a lot of it is just the nostalgia lenses, right? It's like maybe those games, I'm not going to say any of those specifically, but just some games sometimes just don't hold up well. They're just not as fun to play as they used to be. And Ocarina of Time absolutely stands the test of time. It is so much fun to play to this day. Again, I've never beaten this game before. It was incredibly addicting. It is so well designed and it is super intuitive. Sure, it is a little bit clunky and it shows its age graphically especially, but man, Ocarina of Time is still super fun to play, and let's get into a little bit more detail of why that is. Now, while it took me almost 3 decades to finally beat Ocarina of Time, it's not the first Zelda game that I've ever completed, right? I've beaten Twilight Princess, Link to the Past, Wind Waker, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening, which for a while was my favorite Zelda game. Ocarina of Time might have something to say about that, but all this to say that Ocarina of Time has those staples that we're used to, right? The combat, the dungeons, puzzles, and the cool items and equipment that allow you to interact with the world in different ways. Now, Ocarina of Time has all the staples that you would expect in a Zelda game, right? You have your sword, you have your shield, your bow and arrow, your hook shot, boomerang, your bombs. But I was actually caught off guard by some of the cool items and equipment that I wasn't expecting to see in this game. While I've seen clips and know about the game a little bit, I was pleasantly surprised by some of the items that we encountered. For example, one of the main ones that caught me off guard was the hover boots. I didn't know that was a thing. I don't think I've ever seen that before in a Zelda game. So that was quite a shock and pretty interesting. There was some cool utility to it. You can essentially walk on air for a little bit and reach places otherwise you couldn't. So that was pretty cool. The Megaton hammer was also something I wasn't expecting to see. And the bomb chew bombs, those are interesting. At first I was like, what the heck is the point of these? It didn't make any sense. But then later on, as you get to further temples, specifically the desert temple, I realized that they were extremely OP, and I think I kind of abused them a little bit on some of these enemies. But now that we're talking about some of the main items and how that interacts with enemies and puzzles, I wanted to go over the main aspect of Zelda. Usually, in most cases, especially in Ocarina of Time, is kind of where all the elements of this game come together: the combat, the puzzles, item management, using your different equipment. And that is definitely the dungeons. And I would say the dungeons are all really, really well done. Your main ones like the Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, they're all great. And there's some little ones too, like the Ice Cavern or the Well, which were pretty cool too and unexpected. But the dungeons is where it all comes together and the game really, really shines. And I specifically want to talk about in detail the Water Temple. Oh, the Water Temple. It's funny to me because I knew coming into this game that the Water Temple is notorious for being confusing and some would even say challenging. And honestly, it was the one that I spent the most time in just because I was running in circles, not knowing where to go, specifically where you have to go to like the underground levels once you get that like platform to go up. That was where I was stuck, and my problem was that like I got there like a couple days before and I stopped playing for a day or two, and I couldn't remember that I saw that, so I was like running around for like an hour, like where do I go next, but eventually figured out. And I think overall though, as challenging as it was, I think the Water Temple was a great example of all these elements coming in together, right? You got your iron boots to go down to lower levels, you have your hook shot, you have your arrows, using the torches and the fire to solve puzzles with the arrows. using your ocarina so you can adjust the water levels. It all comes together, and overall the water temple is freaking awesome. Awesome, but not perfect. Specifically, two things, right? For me, there's a room on the underground water levels where you have to kill a certain amount of enemies very, very quickly. And it was so difficult for me at the time that I was like thinking, oh my God, I'm missing something here. I got to go find something, come back here, and then I'll figure it out. Or maybe drop the water, right? But no, you literally just had to kill everything as quickly as possible. And I found that part to be a little bit of BS. Also, I think that the hearts affecting how much time you can be underwater, I didn't like that. I was like, well, just give me the whole time. I didn't like having to like back out. Like I actually left the dungeon, go get some more hearts and fairies and stuff in the bottles. That way I was good to go, so I can be underwater for longer. I didn't like that part either. And I'm sure all the Ocarina of Time pros are going to be like, well, why don't you just have the blue tunic? Okay, look, I didn't even know about the blue tunic. Okay, I knew about it. I didn't know how to get it, right? I thought maybe it was in this dungeon. And, you know, I was going back to like the Zoro's domain, and because I remember that guy was still stuck in like the, like that red shell that you need the blue magic for. So I went back, I'm like, oh, I wonder what you get from here. And then after I beat the water temple, I got the blue tunic. So I was like, crap, that would have been so helpful. So yeah, I know the blue tunic would have helped me. But again, in my first time playing, I didn't know. Okay, now that we've discussed combat, the Z targeting system, the dungeons and equipment, another key aspect of these dungeons themselves are the bosses. And I have to say that the bosses overall are pretty freaking awesome. Look, I come from beating all the Souls games, Elden Ring, I just beat Shadow of the Earth Tree, so difficulty isn't really that big of an issue for me usually, but I gotta say, some of these bosses actually killed me a couple times. The one you're looking at now, Unga Unga, killed me at least 3 times, and once I figured out it wasn't that bad. But there's a good amount of challenge, but once you figure out the cycle, what you gotta do, you just kind of rinse and repeat. But overall, really fun and a good use of the equipment and items that you get from the dungeons. And like in true Zelda fashion, these bosses aren't just simply finding the weak point and mashing the sword on them, right? Usually there's like a little puzzle element where you have to figure out how to get to the weak point. And I thought especially for the time that this game came out, a lot of these were very creative. A lot of them kind of go with the idea of bouncing enemy attacks back in one way or another, but overall pretty creative and really fun. Especially, I can't imagine for the time that this came out, it would have been super fresh, and even now it was still a lot of fun for me to play. Now that we've discussed the dungeons and the bosses and equipment, I want to take a step back and go over the overworld of Hyrule and all the locations you can travel. It's incredible when you first start out and you go to Hyrule Field for the first time. The game feels absolutely massive. Like you can just go anywhere and there's way too many places to go. And then as you keep playing, you realize, okay, the game's not that huge, but still there's a lot to explore, a lot of amazing, diverse areas. And I think Ocarina of Time deserves a lot of credit for connecting its areas and making it feel pretty fluid. And I apologize for doing this, but I'm bringing Dark Souls up one more time. And the main reason I want to bring it up now is because in that game, in the very beginning, you start up in a very warm and safe location called Firelink Shrine. And then you go into like this huge journey to find like this bell, right? You have to ring these 2 bells. And you go on this massive journey. You go through a bunch of different locations. And then eventually you take like a lift and it takes you back down to the very first location that you started out at, pretty much. And that was such a big moment for me in that game where I was like, whoa, this is all connected. Like this world is incredible. And not to say it was the same in Ocarina of Time, but I had a little mini moment like that. And of course, in this game, when you transition from one location to the other, it's always like the black screen and the text on there, It's a little bit different, but still, to see these kinds of moments and see, wow, I can go from the Lost Woods to, Death Mountain or to, the lake or whatever. It's such a cool moment, and just wanted to bring that up, and a big part of my experience with the game. All of this to say that the world that you explore in Ocarina of Time, Hyrule, it's
absolutely beautiful. It's connected well. Every area is diverse, not just visually, but with its music, and every place has something for you to see and do, and absolutely love the overworld for Ocarina of Time.
The last piece that I want to talk about gameplay wise is some of the side quests, side missions that you can do in this game. One of the ones you get early on is collecting the Skulltulas, right? There's, I think, at least 100 of these, if not more. And you actually get some pretty good rewards for collecting 30. And then I think it was 20 and 30 get increased wallet sizes. Don't quote me on that, but that was pretty useful. The item exchange, or in this case, the mask exchange, was pretty fun. It was a good way to interact with characters. It gets a little bit weird in the middle of that, but I like that kind of creepiness factor, which we'll get back to again. And then the other one that I did was the Goron Sword quest, which was pretty awesome. There's some time sections in there that were actually really hard, and without Epona, I don't think I could have done them. And I actually failed him at least once, especially the one get up in the mountain. But overall, pretty fun. Some of the mask ones, you know, if you didn't know where to go, I think would be pretty hard to do, which kind of leads me to some of the negatives that I had with the game. So now, some of these things that I'm going to bring up that I have negative feelings about with Zelda are some things that are in most of the Zelda games, right? For me, a big one is rewards, like going to all the rooms to get treasure chests, or completing side quests. Sometimes rewards in this game aren't that awesome, right? It could be some rupees, sometimes a piece of heart. When it comes to that, it's really hard for me to want to go out of the way to do this, because it's just not that awesome of a payoff, right? So I've always had that issue with Zelda games. Now, when you get a new piece of equipment or an item in dungeons, of course, that's awesome. But I've always had that with Zelda games where I love exploring for the sake of exploring. Getting heart pieces is cool, but I wish it was a little bit more, right? And not to compare to Dark Souls all the time, but one thing that they do really, really well is that it's always generally worth going to a new area, right? There's new weapons, new armor. I just wish Zelda incorporated a little bit more flexibility in how they rewarded the players for exploring the map and the game a little bit more. Now, my next big complaint gameplay wise is, look, I think it is pretty difficult at times to know where to go next. I appreciate the freedom that the game gives you. And look, part of this is my fault, right? I'd play the game, stop playing for a couple days, and I'd forget of a clue that go to the graveyard because Dampy and the hook shot, stuff like that, where if you weren't paying really, really close attention, it's just hard to know what to do next sometimes. And I appreciate Navi helping us out, but really she would just kind of repeat the same thing over and over again and just kind of tell me obvious things I already knew. Now, the biggest culprit, at least to me, of a situation like this was with Jabu Jabu, the dungeon, right? With him, where you have to give him a fish. Now, if the game tells you where to do this, or that you should get some fish for him, let me know, because I don't know where it says that, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But that for me was the biggest culprit of this, of like, okay, how the heck was I supposed to know that? And it's so interesting because my favorite Zelda game before Ocarina of Time, Link's Awakening, was super random about its quest and where to go next, right? Especially with like the item exchange. So again, a Zelda trait, not the biggest issue in the world, but just, if I had to add some complaints, that's my biggest one. Now that we've discussed the gameplay in detail, I want to go over my favorite aspect of Ocarina of Time, and that is the world building. Under this part of the video, we're going to go over the presentation, which will include graphics, sound, atmosphere, and see how this package was put together to create such a wonderful and all-time experience. Let's start out by talking about the sound and music of Ocarina of Time. Simply put, the music and the sounds in Ocarina of Time are my main reason as to why this experience was above and beyond most video games I've ever played. Koji Kondo, who was a composer for Ocarina of Time and a lot of the Zelda games, was going absolutely ballistic in the studio. Look, and this is how you know that the music in this game is so memorable. I don't care if you have beaten Ocarina of Time or not. I would bet that most people have heard the sounds from this game, you know, from Nabi to the treasure chest to maybe even like a dubstep remix of Lost Woods, or the sound reference in some capacity, or even a ringtone or text tone or something. But that's how influential the music and sound of this game is. If that's not iconic, I don't know what is. I think out of the main tracks, I think my favorite one obviously is Gerudo Valley or Lost Woods. Either one, both are great, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to come back with Hyrule Field or something else, but let me know in the comments below what your favorite is. But I wanted to get into what the music and the sound is, the ambience and atmosphere in this game. Most of the time it's cheerful, happy, then you turn into adult Link and then things get a little bit wild and it gets a little bit creepy. And that's a theme that comes up a lot, and I absolutely loved it, and I was not prepared for that at all. And I can imagine being a kid playing this, that some of these things would be actually a bit terrifying at times. Like I was just talking about, that moment when you become adult Link is kind of the first time when you really get that creepy vibe going on, aside from maybe the music at the Deku Tree dungeon. But yeah, the game just totally flips, and it's such a jarring change, and I loved it because the game, you know, instead of being a kid, now, you know, you're an adult and things have gone terribly wrong. Ganondorf has the power he was looking for the most part. Princess Zelda's nowhere to be found, and things are just in chaos and ruin. And I love that. The game is oozing an atmosphere, and like I say, for the most part, it's pretty cheerful and kind of quirky. Last piece I wanted to bring up regarding the creepy atmosphere is the creepypasta, you know, videos on Ben Drowned. I'm sure most of you have seen that, heard that. I knew about that, you know, obviously I just beat Ocarina of Time, but I've heard of Ben Drowned. I think originally when it came out, I was really addicted to like creepypastas and got in this rabbit hole of all this creepy stuff. But I can totally see how that was such a big deal and so popular, because these games are creepy. And as I understand it, Ben Drowned's more about Majora's Mask, but which I've yet to play, but I could totally see where that vibe and everything kind of fits in and makes sense. So anyways, if you haven't seen that or gotten into that, go for it. It's really creepy if you're into that stuff. But anyways, I know for those who haven't played Ocarina of Time, I'm making it look like a horror game right now, but for the most part, like I was saying, it is pretty cheerful and happy in Hyrule. I think the best example of how this game generally feels is that moment when you step out into Hyrule Field during the day. That feeling of excitement, of adventure, that's what Ocarina of Time is mainly. And going along with kind of the quirkiness of the game, Zelda always has those weird looking characters, weird moving characters dancing around, doing whatever in like the town plazas and stuff. And this game has plenty of that. And this kind of fits the mold of what this World of Hyrule is. You know, a lot of these characters don't know there's impending doom, what Ganondorf's trying to do till it's too late. But again, this is to me what makes Ocarina of Time so special, right? There's plenty of games where you can run around in 3D in different areas and go on adventures, but to build an actual world that has its own, let's say, atmosphere and tone to it, that's what makes this truly, truly special in my opinion. Now, the other aspect of Ocarina of Time that I wanted to go through here that was so revolutionary was the graphics and the fact that it's 3D. While making this video, I was thinking back, I'm like, wow, I've only said 3D once before this moment in the video. And that's just to show you how much, like, I take that for granted. Now that most games can be 3D, it's not a big deal, first person shooters, whatever. But it was a big deal back in '98. This is the first 3D Zelda. Super Mario 64 changed the game literally, where we got a great 3D platformer. And that's crazy to think about, just how far we've come in those 26 years. And again, I would say that the weakest aspect of this game, and I've said it a couple times in the video already, is its graphic fidelity, right? It just doesn't look great compared to games nowadays. And again, that's not something I hold against the game. And the main reason why is not just because of how fun it is to play, it's because of its art direction. You can tell what they were trying to do, and back then I'm sure this game looked incredible, but even still the graphics are good enough where it doesn't distract you from the greatness of the gameplay and allows Ocarina of Time to still be enjoyable 26 years later. Not to completely contradict what I just said, but the one thing I do have to complain about or just bring up are the fairies. Like, who the heck designed them, and why did they allow them to look like that in this game? What the hell? Okay, so we're at the final and shortest part of the video, the story. We're not going to go too crazy about the story. Story has never really been, in my opinion, in my eyes, the strong part of the Zelda games. I do enjoy kind of reading about the lore, about the different timelines and links and everything like that. I think that's pretty cool outside of the games, the overall kind of just lore of the franchise. But in terms of the individual games, usually it's pretty simple story-wise. So kind of your typical Zelda storyline where Ganondorf is trying to get the pieces of the Triforce to rule over Hyrule and be, you know, essentially the king, whatever supreme power in the world. And Zelda and Link, the hero of time, is trying to stop him. What is cool though in this story specifically is, and it's a very common trait in Zelda games where you go between timelines, specifically in this case young and adult Link, which was pretty cool because it is pretty varied, not just visually how you look, but the items you can use and all that. And I think that's my favorite aspect of this, is that back and forth between the timelines. Another aspect that I enjoyed about the story was the relationships and interactions with other characters. With Zelda, there's a bit of a plot twist in there with her, which is pretty interesting. And if you haven't been Ocarina of Time, won't be a big surprise. It's pretty obvious, but I won't spoil it here just in case. But I love the relationship that Link has with her. The ending is pretty touching in my opinion. I love his relationship with Malon as well. And just to see the differences between young Link and adult Link and talking to characters. And you can sometimes do some kind of like butterfly effect stuff where you can do something as adult Link that'll change stuff as young Link or vice versa. So again, those aspects are actually pretty interesting. But in terms of the overall story, it's sufficient enough to kind of keep everything moving forward and having, you know, an end goal that you're trying to get to. But with that, we've reached the end of the video. I wasn't expecting to get almost to the 30-minute mark, but there we go. Ocarina of Time, obviously, if you haven't gotten this already from the video, was absolutely amazing. Even 26 years later, even having completing amazing masterpieces recently like Red Dead, Hollow Knight, doesn't matter. Ocarina of Time, like I said before, absolutely stands the test of time, and I totally 100% understand why people consider it the masterpiece of masterpieces. And it was such a joy to play, and you know, if I played this as a kid, it'd probably be my favorite game of all time. And again, like I said, I had such a wonderful experience, and I'm glad I finally had the opportunity to play through this incredible game. And while the game isn't perfect, I always say this, is there hasn't been a game that I've played that was perfect, and that's not the point. This game, with its music, with its gameplay, its world building, its atmosphere, its characters, everything just becomes this incredible package that hasn't been recreated, and you really can't. And this is one of those times where one of the older games, original staples, is better than most of the recent ones. And yes, Ocarina of Time for me is the best Zelda game I've ever played. Better than Link's Awakening, better than Breath of the Wild, better than Twilight Princess for me. It's close, but even still, 26 years later, it was the best Zelda experience I've ever had. And I don't know how people feel about this, but I think this is one of those games where, while it's still incredible to play and super fun, seeing a remake with maybe a little bit of an expanded world, obviously new graphics, maybe on the Switch 2 would be something I would really look forward to. And I don't think it's saying that, oh, Ocarina of Time needs to be
put in the back burner and, it's too old. No, I'm not saying that. I just think it would be a cool thing to see one of the best games of all time get a remake, because I think it deserves it. And just for the sake of consistency, if we got to give it a rating, obviously Ocarina of Time, even 26 years later, is an absolute 10 out of 10 masterpiece of masterpieces. Such a great game. And guys, thank you so much for watching the video. It's been a minute since I released the video, been a couple months, but we'll get back on it. Very motivated to get some more content out for you guys. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and have a great day. And again, I'll catch you on the next one. See you.